Hello everyone and welcome to my latest Rust Quickie. In my previous Rust Quickie I have talked about the if and else statement in Rust, and today I want to show you how you can implement loops in Rust. So let's switch over to Visual Studio Code where I want to explain loops in more detail to you. The simplest loop that Rust provides you is the loop statement. As you can see from the description, the loop statement just runs indefinitely, means without any additional condition that loop statement just runs forever. And therefore we have here an exit criteria, so we have a variable called loop counter. If that loop counter is larger than a provided value, we are returning from that loop counter. The loop counter variable is defined here at the beginning of our function. It's an integer value. I have defined that variable as mutable because we also have to increment the loop counter here. And the variable I is an input parameter value that we are getting here, means when we run now that loop statement with a value of 5, we are iterating a few times through that loop. So let's run that statement with the cargo run command, and you can see our current loop counter goes from 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, and afterwards we are just returning from that loop. So this is very important. When you're working with a loop statement, you also have to define a condition which just exits the loop, otherwise you have an endless loop created. To work with loops in a more efficient and more easier way, Rust also provides you the famous for statement, the for loop. As you can see, we are defining here a range, so we are iterating here beginning from the value 0 up to the value that we provide with that variable I. Very important here is when you are defining that range from 0 to I, the value of I is always exclusive. So for example, when we provide here for the variable I a value of 5, we are iterating here from 0 to 1, 2, 3 and 4. Value 5 is not part of that loop anymore because the value I is just exclusive, and that current loop value, so the value 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4 is stored in that loop variable n, which is just here an integer variable. So the variable that we have defined previously explicitly during the loop statement is here defined directly with the for statement. So when we run that, you see our current loop counter goes from 0 to 1, 2, 3 and finally 4. I have here a few more code fragments that are showing how you can work with for loops in Rust. As we already said, when you have a range from something to something, like from 0 to 5, that end value is always excluded. So when we are running that loop here, we are getting out to the console the values 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4. The value of 5 is always excluded. If you want to include that value of 5, you have to use that special syntax. So in that case, when we are running that loop, we are printing out the values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 to the console, because the end value of that loop is also included. You can also print out values from an array. As you already know from one of my previous Rust Quickies, an array is always static, so the size of that array is known during the compilation time, so you can't change an array, but you can iterate over an array. Very easy, again with the for loop statement. So in that case we are printing out the values 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4, and of course you can also use the for statement to iterate over other array values. Here we have iterated over integer values. So as you can see, we have here an array of I32 values, 5 values, and here in the second step we have an array of string references. We have 3 string references, the references to SQL Server, Oracle and MySQL. Means that value of n here is now also a string reference. So the loop variable that you are defining in a loop in Rust doesn't have to be an integer value, it can be also some other value, like in that case a string reference. And of course you can also use the for statement to iterate over a vector. As you also already know, a vector is allocated during runtime on the heap, and therefore you can also change a vector. So you can add elements, you can remove elements, you can sort a vector, you can do a lot of different things with a vector. And here we're just printing out the individual values from that vector, and in that case the value of n, the loop variable, is again an integer value. So let's run that. Let's make that a little bit larger, the output, so that we can see more. So as you can see, we have here our first loop, which prints out the values 0 to 5 to 4. Value of 5 is excluded. The second loop, the value of 5 is included. So this, as you can see, we are printing out 0 to 5. The next step, we print out our array values 0 to 4, and finally we print out the array of string references, SQL Server, Oracle and MySQL, and in the last loop we have iterated over an integer vector with 3 values, the value of 1, 2 and 3. Another loop statement that Rust provides you is the famous while statement. So as you can see, with the while statement you have again a condition. In our case the condition is loop counter smaller than I, and the loop runs as long as that condition is evaluated to true. As you can see, I'm defining here again a variable loop counter. It's mutable because inside the loop we are incrementing that loop counter, and as long as that loop counter is smaller than the provided input parameter value to that function, which is in our case 5, we print out the loop counter. So when we run that code, you can see we are printing out the values 0 to 4. When you work with loops in Rust, you can also use special statements like the continue statement. As you can see, I'm defining here again a while loop with a condition. We execute that loop while the loop counter is smaller than the provided input value, and then we just check if the current loop counter is an even number. If the loop counter is an even number, we increment the loop counter, and afterwards we just continue our execution. Means we don't execute the remaining part of our loop. We just continue with the next iteration of that loop. Otherwise, if the current loop counter is an odd number, we don't evaluate that condition to true, means we don't execute that code, and therefore we just print out the loop counter, and finally we increment that loop counter. We call here that function with an input parameter value of 10, means the value of I is 10, and therefore that simple while loop just prints out all odd numbers from 0 up to 10. So let's run that code with the cargo run command, and as you can see, we have here the values of 1, 3, 5, 7 and 9, so all the odd numbers between 0 and the value of 10. So the continue statement is also very, very powerful, because you can just stop the current execution of an iteration and you just continue with the next iteration of that loop. Cool, so thanks for watching my Rust Quickie today. I hope you have learned here a lot about loops in Rust, and I'm already looking forward to see you next week again, where I want to talk in more detail about the so-called match statement in Rust, which is also very, very powerful. So stay tuned. Thank you.